The story of German brides whose husbands served on the front lines of the Second World War is a complex and deeply human chapter in the broader history of wartime Europe, revealing the emotional, social, and political pressures that shaped women's lives during one of the most turbulent eras of the 20th century. These women stood at the intersection of personal devotion and national obligation, bearing the weight of their husband's absence while navigating a society dominated by ideological expectations, material shortages, and constant uncertainty. Their experiences cannot be simplified into a single narrative, for the realities they faced stretched from hopeful beginnings, courtships shaped by youthful idealism and dreams of a peaceful future, to the grinding strain of separation, fear, and profound emotional endurance. Many brides entered marriage with men who were already deployed, forging relationships through hurried wartime ceremonies or incomplete bonding moments overshadowed by the possibility of impending loss. Letters became their most precious link to the battlefield, carrying fragments of affection, anxiety, and longing that sustained emotional connection even as the war consumed their husbands' daily lives. These women learned to read between the lines of every message, sensing danger in pauses, changes in tone, or prolonged silence, while simultaneously presenting a mask of steadiness for family members, neighbors, and the state. Daily life brought its own challenges, from managing households with limited resources to balancing personal responsibilities with expectations imposed by Nazi ideology, which glorified the role of the soldier's wife as a symbol of loyalty, sacrifice, and purity. Propaganda celebrated them as strong, devoted German women who stood proudly behind their fighting men. Yet this idealized image often clashed sharply with their lived reality. Behind closed doors, countless brides struggled with fear for their husband's safety, the loneliness of prolonged separation, and the burden of raising children alone while the war intensified around them. Some attached themselves to the emotional comfort of community networks, neighbors, extended family, and fellow military wives, while others faced isolation, displacement, or the collapse of support structures as bombings, relocations, and wartime chaos reshaped the fabric of German society. The emotional toll grew heavier as the conflict dragged on, and the news from the front became increasingly grim. For many, the war delivered irreversible heartbreak, missing inaction notices, terse death telegrams, or the silent void left by men who never returned. Even those whose husbands survived had to confront the challenging post-war reality of reuniting with men who had been physically, mentally, or morally transformed by the trauma of combat and defeat. After 1945, brides who had once been celebrated as symbols of national endurance were suddenly forced to navigate a nation in ruins, a collapsing ideology, and the difficult task of rebuilding their lives amid scarcity, occupation, and social upheaval. Some marriages fractured under the weight of loss, injury, or ideological disillusionment, while others emerged stronger through shared resilience and mutual understanding. The legacy of these women endures as a testament to the millions of private battles fought far from the front lines, battles not marked by gunfire, but by endurance, devotion, grief, and an unyielding effort to hold together the fragile threads of normalcy while the world around them was consumed by war. Their experiences illuminate not only the emotional dimensions of the Second World War, but also the often overlooked ways in which ordinary individuals bore the immense weight of national conflict in their most intimate relationships and personal lives. In understanding their stories, we gain a fuller, more textured picture of wartime Germany, one that extends beyond military strategy and political decisions to the quiet struggles, small triumphs, and deeply human sacrifices of those who waited at home for the men they loved. From the earliest days of the Nazi movement, The crafting of an idealized image of womanhood served as a foundational pillar of the broader ideological project. This image, artificial, selective, and deliberately mythologized, did not emerge naturally from German tradition, but was instead sculpted by propagandists, racial theorists, and policymakers who sought to reshape German society at its core. The Nazis believed that to build their envisioned thousand-year Reich, they first had to reorganize the very structure of family life, gender expectations, and reproductive norms. Women, in this vision, were not autonomous individuals, but symbolic vessels carrying the future of what the regime defined as the Aryan race. The project of constructing this myth required relentless storytelling across speeches, posters, films, school books, and even architectural aesthetics. Each medium reinforced a singular narrative. The perfect German woman was biologically pure, politically obedient, physically robust, and spiritually committed to her duties as wife and mother. Yet beneath this orchestrated ideal lay contradictions, hypocrisies, and coercive forces that shaped women's lives in profound and often devastating ways. Nazi ideology fused biology and aesthetics into a single, rigid system of value that defined human worth through physical appearance. Within this system, beauty was not subjective or culturally fluid, but a political instrument rooted in the pseudo-scientific frameworks of racial theory. The regime elevated certain physical traits: blonde hair, blue eyes, tall stature, symmetrical features, athletic build, not merely as preferences but as evidence of biological superiority. These traits were portrayed as direct markers of Aryan purity, signaling a lineage supposedly uncorrupted by racial mixing. The mythic image of the ideal German woman became a central figure in this obsession. She embodied what the Nazis believed to be the pinnacle of racial refinement: clarity of features, robust health, and a natural, unadorned beauty that symbolized the purity of the nation itself. Yet this constructed aesthetic standard was far from innocent. It served as a mechanism of control, exclusion, and coercion. It transformed bodies into political landscapes, subjecting women to constant scrutiny while legitimizing violence against those deemed physically inferior. The roots of this fixation lay in the racial science movements that gained traction across Europe in the late 19th century. Anthropologists, physicians, and eugenicists attempted to classify humanity through physical measurements, skull shapes, facial angles, and proportions they believed revealed inherent moral and intellectual traits. In Germany, these ideas blended with nationalist sentiment, producing a racial aesthetic that linked beauty to destiny. The Nazis adopted these frameworks wholeheartedly, despite their scientific invalidity, because they provided a veneer of legitimacy for their political goals. Beauty became the outward expression of inward racial integrity. Under this system, the ideal woman's appearance was not simply a matter of individual preference, but an indicator of whether she embodied the genetic qualities necessary to contribute to the Volk. The body thus became a site of racial evaluation, its features interpreted through the lens of ideology rather than personal identity. Nazi propaganda played a crucial role in popularizing this racialized concept of beauty. Posters, films, and magazines depicted young women with luminous skin, braided blonde hair, and serene expressions. Their bodies were depicted as strong and vital, often shown engaging in sports or working outdoors. These images projected an aesthetic of natural purity, devoid of excessive ornamentation or urban sophistication. The ideal woman did not rely on cosmetics or fashion trends. Her beauty was framed as inherent, effortless, and biologically determined. This emphasis on naturalness served to differentiate Aryan women from the caricatured stereotypes the regime used to dehumanize others. Jewish women, for instance, were portrayed in propaganda as deceitful, overly sexualized, or physically unattractive, images designed to reinforce racial boundaries. The stark contrast between the idealized Aryan woman and her vilified others demonstrated how aesthetics became a tool of political manipulation. But the Nazi obsession with physical perfection extended beyond visual representation. It influenced public policy, education, and even medical practice. Girls in school were taught to evaluate themselves according to racial criteria, learning to identify desirable and undesirable traits in both themselves and others. Physical education emphasized posture, stamina, and coordination, linking athleticism with biological fitness. Health examinations became venues for racial assessment, with doctors trained to identify hereditary traits that aligned or conflicted with state-defined ideals. Women were encouraged to maintain their bodies not for personal well-being, but for the reproductive health of their future children. The regime framed physical maintenance as a patriotic duty. Healthy skin, strong bones, and robust fertility were all seen as contributions to the racial future of Germany. In this worldview, beauty and biology were fused. The body was both symbol and instrument of national survival. This fusion led to the rise of state-sponsored beauty competitions and public celebrations of racially exemplary women. Events such as the Reich Bride Schools and the Mother's Cross ceremonies glorified women who embodied the regime's ideals, while subtly punishing those who did not. Bride schools taught young women how to cultivate a wholesome, natural appearance that reflected racial purity. Instruction emphasized modesty, cleanliness, and physical health over fashion or glamour. Meanwhile, the Mother's Cross, the medal awarded to women who bore large numbers of racially suitable children, celebrated not only fertility but conformity to the state's aesthetic and biological expectations. Recipients were often photographed and profiled in newspapers as living embodiments of the regime's values. These women became icons of state-approved femininity, symbols meant to inspire compliance and admiration. The obsession with physical perfection also influenced Nazi marriage and reproduction policies. The state sought to control sexual relationships by encouraging unions that would strengthen the racial gene pool. Prospective couples were sometimes required to undergo medical and hereditary evaluations before receiving marriage approval. Physical characteristics played a significant role in this process, often overshadowing personal compatibility or emotional connection. Men were encouraged to choose wives who displayed the visible traits of Aryan purity, fair complexion, strong physique, harmonious facial proportions, believing these qualities would produce healthy, racially valuable offspring. Women, in turn, were taught that their desirability depended not on personality or intellect, but on their alignment with the racial ideal. Thus, intimate relationships became arenas of state intervention, shaped not by affection, but by ideology. Yet the standards the Nazis set were not only restrictive but fundamentally unattainable. The ideal woman was a constructed fiction. No single person could embody all the traits the regime demanded. Even prominent Nazi women, such as Magda Goebbels or Gertrude Schultz-Klink, did not perfectly align with the racial aesthetic promoted in propaganda. Nevertheless, they were held up as symbols of idealized femininity, demonstrating the flexibility of these standards when politically convenient. This inconsistency revealed the underlying truth. The obsession with beauty was never about achieving perfection, but about enforcing conformity and loyalty. The ideal served as a benchmark against which all women could be judged, disciplined, or excluded. The impossibility of achieving it ensured that women remained in a perpetual state of striving, and therefore control. The phrase Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, did not originate with the Nazis, but the regime adopted it with unprecedented political intensity, transforming a cultural cliché into a governing principle of gender policy. For Nazi ideologues, this triad captured the essence of womanhood, reducing female identity to a narrow sphere of domestic and reproductive duties. Yet the regime's interpretation went beyond mere tradition. It reshaped the home into an ideological battlefield, where every action of a woman, from bearing children to maintaining her household, was framed as a service to the nation. The private realm became public property, and the family became a microcosm of the racial state. In this framework, motherhood was elevated from a personal choice to a political mandate. The care of children became a means of securing the nation's future. The kitchen became the site of nutritional engineering for a strong population, and religion was invoked selectively to bolster obedience and moral discipline. This reinterpretation transformed ordinary domestic roles into instruments of political control, binding women's daily lives to the wider goals of the regime. Central to the Nazi vision of society was the idea that women were biologically destined for domesticity. The regime rejected the possibility that gender roles could be shaped by culture, economics, or personal ambition. Instead, they claimed that nature itself had determined women to be mothers, caregivers, and moral guardians. This claim masked the political interests underlying their gender policies. By linking female identity to biology, the state aimed to eliminate debate and ensure compliance. Women were told that resisting domestic roles was a rejection not only of societal expectation, but of nature itself. This rhetoric served to delegitimize feminist movements and social reforms of the Weimar era, which had expanded women's access to education and employment. Under Nazi rule, such progress was condemned as unnatural and harmful, portrayed as evidence of societal decay rather than as steps toward equality. This ideological framing allowed the regime to dismantle women's rights while presenting the process as restorative rather than oppressive. Motherhood occupied a central place within this triad, not as an emotional or familial relationship, but as a state-managed function critical to racial survival. The regime's population policies sought to increase the birth rate of children deemed racially valuable. Women were encouraged, indeed pressured, to have large families, with incentives ranging from financial benefits to public honors such as the Mother's Cross. Motherhood became a form of national service, celebrated with the same reverence as military sacrifice. In propaganda, the mother was depicted as the silent hero of the Reich, her worth measured not by her talents or achievements, but by the number and quality of children she produced. This emphasis served two purposes. It expanded the future labor and military force while reinforcing racial ideology. Children were not simply family members, but resources for the state, and their mothers were custodians of a biological future that the regime sought to control with precision. The kitchen, the second sphere of the triad, likewise took on political significance under Nazi rule. Domestic labor was reframed as an essential contribution to national strength. The state promoted an idealized vision of rural household management, emphasizing thrift, efficiency, and nutrition. Women were taught how to prepare simple meals using local, seasonal ingredients, aligning culinary practices with the regime's autarkic economic goals. The National Socialist Women's League, NS Frauenschaft, organized classes on cooking and food preservation, treating these skills as patriotic duties rather than personal or familial responsibilities. The daily act of preparing meals became intertwined with the politics of self-sufficiency and racial health. Even the design of household appliances and kitchens was influenced by ideological goals. Efficiency was framed not merely as a convenience, but as a moral obligation, enabling women to devote more time to child-rearing and community activities that supported the regime. Church, the third domain of the triad, occupied a more complex role. The Nazis had an ambivalent relationship with organized religion, viewing it as both a potential competitor for loyalty and a useful tool for shaping moral conduct. While the regime sought to control or weaken established churches, it also co-opted religious language and symbolism to strengthen its gender policies. Women were encouraged to embrace virtues such as obedience, humility, and sacrifice, traits historically associated with Christian femininity. Religious rhetoric was used to sanctify motherhood and domestic service, portraying them as sacred duties. Yet the regime's use of religion was highly selective. Church teachings that supported patriarchal family structures were highlighted, while doctrines advocating compassion, equality, or individual dignity were ignored or suppressed. In this manner, the Nazis harnessed the cultural authority of religion without accepting its ethical constraints, using it to reinforce their political agenda. Beyond shaping individual behavior, the Kinder, Kucha, Kirche ideal functioned as a mechanism of social organization. The regime relied on women to serve as cultural transmitters, passing on ideological values within the household. Mothers were responsible for instilling discipline, loyalty, and racial awareness in their children, long before they entered formal education. Girls, especially, were raised to internalize these expectations from an early age, learning to see their future in terms of domestic and reproductive duty. This intergenerational transmission of ideology was essential to the regime's long-term goals. While men fought wars and governed the state, women were tasked with preserving its ideological foundation. The home became the first classroom of the Reich, where the boundaries of acceptable thought and behavior were established. This responsibility granted women a certain symbolic importance, even as it restricted their autonomy and subjected their individuality to the needs of the state. The state also mobilized organizations to enforce these gender norms. The NS-Frauenschaft and the League of German Girls, BDM, played key roles in shaping women's identities according to political expectations. The NS-Frauenschaft focused on married women and mothers, offering instruction in domestic skills and ideological training. Its programs emphasized self-sacrifice, racial duty, and household discipline. The BDM, on the other hand, targeted young girls, preparing them for future roles as mothers and housemakers. Physical fitness, outdoor activities, and lessons in racial science were all designed to cultivate strong, obedient future mothers. Participation in these organizations created a structured path that guided girls from childhood into state-approved womanhood, making deviation difficult and dissent dangerous. Women who attempted to pursue independent careers or personal ambitions faced social pressure, legal obstacles, and often outright discrimination. Motherhood in Nazi Germany was not merely encouraged, it was engineered. The regime built an elaborate apparatus that transformed the intimate act of raising children into a public service regulated by the state. At the heart of this machinery was a belief that the future of the Reich depended on mothers who would produce and raise racially valuable children. To ensure this outcome, Nazi officials designed policies that reached into nearly every corner of family life. Birth incentives, marriage loans, eugenic screenings, sterilization programs, surveillance of pregnant women, and state-sponsored honors that politicized childbirth. Motherhood, under this system, was no longer a private identity, but a state-orchestrated role. Women became biological instruments in a national project that sought to increase the quantity and improve the quality of the population. The family home became an extension of state policy, and motherhood became both a privilege and an obligation, rewarded, monitored, and exploited. At the foundation of this system was the regime's eugenic ideology, which classified people based on perceived hereditary value. The law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, enacted in 1933, formalized this approach by authorizing compulsory sterilization of individuals with conditions deemed heritable. Around 400,000 people were sterilized under its provisions. Though these policies targeted both men and women, women bore a disproportionate psychological and physical burden, as their reproductive capacities were the primary focus of state intervention. The state dictated who could reproduce, under what circumstances, and with whom. The machinery of eugenics intertwined with motherhood, creating a hierarchy of women, those deemed fit to bear children and those whose fertility was deemed dangerous. This brutal system showcased how the state weaponized medical authority to control women's bodies and shape the demographic future of the country. Marriage was another carefully regulated domain within this machinery. The marriage loan program, introduced in 1933, offered newlywed couples interest-free loans on the condition that the wife leave the workforce. The policy served two intertwined purposes. It removed women from economic competition with men and encouraged them to focus on motherhood. With each child born, a quarter of the loan was forgiven, meaning that mothers of 4 children repaid nothing. The policy rewarded reproductive productivity, framing childbirth as a civic contribution. Yet these incentives were reserved only for couples who met racial standards. Marriage itself required genetic screening, and prospective spouses could be denied marriage licenses if deemed heritably unfit. Thus, even the formation of families became a bureaucratic process shaped by the state's racial agenda. Love, compatibility, and personal aspiration were subordinated to ideological criteria. The Nazi regime's vision of the perfect Aryan woman rested on a contradiction that would become increasingly visible as Germany moved from peacetime mobilization to total war. In its ideological blueprints, the ideal woman existed primarily in the domestic sphere. She was a mother, caretaker, homemaker, and moral guardian of the racial community. Yet the reality of governing a modern industrial state, especially one preparing for and then fighting a massive war, presented challenges that ideology alone could not solve. As the war intensified, the Nazi state grew dependent on the very women it had pushed out of the workforce. Factories, farms, hospitals, and administrative offices needed labor, and millions of women were drawn into roles that directly contradicted their assigned place in Nazi doctrine. This tension exposed the limits of propaganda and revealed how political idealism clashed with economic necessity, forcing the regime to improvise, adapt, and often ignore its own prescriptions. Before the outbreak of war, Nazi leaders took pride in reducing the number of women in professional and industrial work. Policies implemented between 1933 and 1937 limited women's participation in the civil service, law, medicine, and university education. Marriage loans and public campaigns discouraged women from pursuing careers, framing employment as a selfish act that deprived German men of jobs and distracted women from their maternal purpose. Women were encouraged to leave workplaces and return to their homes, where their fertility was celebrated as a patriotic duty. These policies were initially successful in reducing female employment in certain professional fields. However, they failed to recognize that women were already an integral part of Germany's industrial and agricultural economy. Removing them strained production, forcing employers to rely on younger workers, part-time laborers, and eventually foreign laborers. The early years of the war made the contradictions even sharper. As men were drafted into the military, labor shortages in agriculture, manufacturing, and transportation became severe. Factories essential for the war effort, producing munitions, uniforms, machinery, and supplies, could not operate without a stable workforce. Initially, the regime attempted to solve this problem by relying on forced labor from occupied territories, and millions were brought into Germany to work under brutal conditions. Yet this strategy did not eliminate the need for German women. Their skills, literacy, and familiarity with German workplaces made them indispensable in many areas. Despite this reality, Nazi officials hesitated to fully mobilize women, fearing that doing so would contradict the ideological image of women as domestic figures committed to family life. Propaganda struggled to adjust, presenting women's war work as an extension of maternal duty rather than a departure from it. Agricultural work was one of the first sectors where women's contributions became impossible to ignore. Farms across Germany were already dependent on women's labor even before the war, particularly in rural areas. As more male farmers were conscripted, women became the primary workforce managing livestock, harvesting crops, maintaining equipment, and overseeing daily operations. Organizations such as the Reich Labor Service for Women provided structured labor through camps and training programs, sending young women to rural districts to support production. Posters and pamphlets framed this work as noble and patriotic, drawing upon imagery of strong, healthy German women working the fields. Yet many women experienced the work as exhausting and underappreciated, especially as food shortages worsened. The regime praised agricultural labor in its rhetoric, but provided limited support to those who performed it. In industrial settings, the contradictions were even more visible. Factories required increasingly skilled labor to meet wartime needs, and many women were placed in technical positions that the regime had previously claimed were unsuitable for them. Women became machine operators, transport workers, welders, and assembly line technicians. Some received specialized training, while others learned on the job under intense pressure. Despite their essential contributions, women were often paid less than men, given fewer rations, and denied recognition for their work. Employers complained about shortages, even as large numbers of women remained underutilized due to ideological restrictions. The resulting inefficiency highlighted the clash between Nazi gender doctrine and industrial reality. Ultimately, economic demands pushed the state to quietly loosen its restrictions, even as public rhetoric highlighted traditional gender roles. The regime's propaganda struggled to reconcile these shifts. Films, newsreels, and posters continued to depict women primarily as mothers and homemakers, even as millions were working long hours in factories and fields. The state reframed women's labor as a temporary wartime necessity, emphasizing that their contributions were part of their broader duty as guardians of the nation. Women were told that they were working for the front, just as soldiers were fighting for the homeland. This narrative attempted to maintain ideological consistency by portraying all-female labor as an extension of maternal sacrifice. Nonetheless, the gap between propaganda and lived experience widened. Women who had returned to domestic life under the influence of earlier policies now found themselves back in the workforce, often under more demanding conditions than before. Healthcare and nursing services represented another critical sphere of women's wartime involvement. The need for medical personnel skyrocketed as casualties increased, and women in nursing organizations such as the Red Cross became central to the war effort. They staffed hospitals, field clinics, and rehabilitation centers, often working under dangerous and exhausting circumstances. These roles were easier for the regime to accommodate ideologically, as caregiving aligned with traditional feminine ideals. Yet the scale of women's involvement far exceeded what Nazi planners had envisioned. Nurses and medical workers were deployed to frontline areas where they faced trauma, bombardment, and immense responsibility. Their experiences underscored the indispensable nature of women's labor and the regime's inability to limit their roles without undermining the war effort. Behind the polished surfaces of Nazi propaganda, which glorified the obedient, dutiful, and racially pure Aryan woman, lived millions of real women whose experiences defied the uniform image imposed upon them. Their lives were shaped not only by ideology, but by personal struggle, moral conflict, and acts of resilience that unfolded in the shadows of a totalitarian state. For some, survival meant quietly enduring. For others, it meant resisting in whatever ways they could, whether through protecting marginalized neighbors, saving forbidden literature, or refusing to conform to racial and reproductive expectations. These individual stories reveal a diversity of experiences that the regime sought to erase. They expose the vast gap between the idealized woman depicted in posters and the complex, often painful realities that defined women's daily lives. In this chapter, the narrative shifts from ideology to humanity, From stereotypes to the deeply personal accounts that illuminate how real women navigated a world built on coercion, surveillance, and fear. The collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945 shattered not only the political and military power of the regime, but also the ideological fantasies it had imposed on millions of women. The myth of the perfect Aryan woman, a figure crafted through propaganda, coercion, and selective glorification, crumbled under the weight of defeat, destruction, and exposure of the regime's atrocities. As Allied forces liberated Europe and the horrors of the Nazi system were revealed, the ideological structure that shaped German womanhood was stripped of its false glamour. What remained was the undeniable truth. The ideal had been built on exploitation, violence, and manipulation. In the ruins of Germany's cities and in the testimonies of survivors, the myth dissolved, replaced by a sobering recognition of how deeply totalitarian ideology had infiltrated the private and public lives of women. In the immediate aftermath of defeat, German women faced a world transformed beyond recognition. Their homes were destroyed, their families scattered, and their communities ruptured by the consequences of war. Many became heads of households overnight, responsible for securing food, rebuilding homes, and caring for children in the chaos of occupation. The wartime reality that had already forced women into labor now expanded further as they worked in clearing rubble, restoring infrastructure, and supporting families in a devastated nation. Ironically, the collapse of the regime created a new reality that directly contradicted the Nazi claim that women belonged exclusively in domestic roles. The post-war landscape demanded resilience, capability, and independence, qualities women had shown throughout the war despite ideological prohibitions. In this new context, the rigid gender expectations of the past revealed themselves as impractical and fundamentally flawed. The process of denazification brought additional challenges. Women who had participated in Nazi organizations, whether enthusiastically or out of obligation, were required to confront their past involvement. Some had served in auxiliary roles within the party, others in welfare programs or youth organizations. While their positions were often less scrutinized than those of male officials, they were nonetheless implicated in the system's operations. Many claimed ignorance or insisted they had merely followed expectations, illustrating how deeply social pressure had influenced their participation. At the same time, many women who had resisted, opposed, or simply endured the regime emerged with stories that contradicted the propaganda narratives of female passivity or compliance. These personal histories became essential to understanding the nuanced roles women played in sustaining or resisting a totalitarian state. The myth of the ideal Aryan woman also dissolved in the face of the immense trauma that the regime had inflicted. Survivors of concentration camps, forced labor, sterilization programs, and wartime violence brought forth testimonies that exposed the brutality behind Nazi racial and gender ideology. Their stories revealed how the regime targeted women along lines of race, ethnicity, political belief, disability, and social status. The glorified image of womanhood had always been a narrow, exclusive construct that valued only those who fit a manufactured ideal while dehumanizing and destroying countless others. In post-war Germany, the voices of survivors played a crucial role in dismantling this myth and confronting the moral failures embedded within it. As Europe began rebuilding, women encountered new opportunities and new challenges. The shortages of men due to wartime casualties created a demographic imbalance that gave women greater social and economic responsibilities. In both East and West Germany, women entered the workforce in greater numbers than before the war, taking on roles in education, healthcare, industry, and government. The reorganization of society in the post-war years created spaces for women to redefine their identities outside the constraints of Nazi ideology. Yet these changes were not without tension. The desire to rebuild traditional family structures coexisted with the recognition that women had proven essential in sustaining society through collapse. This tension shaped debates about gender roles, motherhood, and labor for decades to come.